8 years after our divorce, my ex-wife mocked me at our high school reunion, but she never imagined that the quiet man she laughed at had become a billionaire. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's emotional journey, I would like to ask for your support. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about resilience, redemption, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you will always be among the first to know whenever we release a new video. It only takes a few seconds. It is completely free, and your support helps us continue bringing you touching and unforgettable stories from the heart. We truly appreciate every single one of you. We would also love to know where you are watching from today. Leave the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below so we can welcome viewers from all around the world. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Now, without further delay, let us return to our main character and discover how one unforgettable reunion changed everything. The people who laugh at your past are often the least prepared for your future. Those words had never meant much to me until the evening I walked through the front doors of Jefferson High School for our 10-year reunion, 8 years after my divorce from Monica. The familiar scent of polished gym floors mixed with catered food drifted through the lobby, while old photographs covered the walls, reminding everyone of a time when life still felt predictable. I adjusted the cuff of my navy blue suit, took a slow breath, and smiled politely at the volunteer checking names at the registration table. Nobody gave me a second look. That was exactly how I wanted it. The reunion committee had transformed the school gym into an elegant banquet hall with white tablecloths, soft golden lights, and a jazz trio playing near the stage. Former classmates stood in small circles, laughing louder than necessary, comparing careers, marriages, and children as though adulthood had become one long competition. I recognized almost every face, even if time had softened some and hardened others. Some greeted me with polite surprise. Others searched my face for clues about the man I had become since disappearing from their lives years ago. I answered every question with a simple smile, never offering more than they asked. Then I heard a laugh I would have recognized anywhere. Monica stood near the refreshment table wearing an elegant emerald green dress, surrounded by several former classmates. 8 years had changed her appearance only slightly, but the confidence in her posture was unmistakable. She noticed me almost immediately. For just a brief second, our eyes met across the room. I nodded politely, believing that would be the end of it. Instead, she walked directly toward me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with calm certainty. The conversations around us seemed to quiet without anyone asking them to. "Well," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "I honestly did not expect you to show up." I smiled. "It has been a long time." She glanced at my suit before looking back into my face. "I guess some things never change. Still keeping things simple, huh?" A few people nearby chuckled awkwardly. I could have answered in 100 different ways, but silence felt stronger. Monica folded her arms comfortably. "Everyone, this is Caleb. We were married once, believe it or not." More laughter followed. Someone jokingly asked if we had remained friends. Monica shook her head before I could answer. Life has a funny way of sorting people into the places they belong. The sentence floated through the room like perfume, sweet on the surface and sharp underneath. Several classmates exchanged uncomfortable looks, while others pretended to sip their drinks instead of reacting. I simply picked up a glass of sparkling water from a nearby tray and thanked the server. My heartbeat stayed steady. 8 years earlier, those words might have shattered me. Tonight, they landed without leaving a mark. Monica mistook my calm for embarrassment. She had no idea that the quiet man standing in front of her was no longer chasing anyone's approval. She believed she was looking at the same broken husband she had left behind. And as more classmates gathered around to watch the exchange unfold, I realized that the longest 8 years of my life were about to collide with the shortest 5 minutes of hers. I stood there with the glass of sparkling water still in my hand while the room slowly returned to its conversations, but something had already changed. Monica smiled as though she had won another small victory, then turned back toward the circle of former classmates surrounding her. They welcomed her attention with easy laughter, the kind that came naturally when people believed they were standing beside the successful side of history. I did not interrupt them. I simply watched for another moment before quietly walking toward one of the old display cases near the gym entrance. Inside were faded photographs from football games, school plays, science fairs, and graduation day. My senior portrait stared back at me from behind the glass, frozen in time beside Monica's. We had been voted most likely to build a beautiful future together. Looking at those words now felt strangely peaceful instead of painful. We had believed them once. Back then, neither of us imagined how quickly dreams could bend under the weight of real life. 8 years earlier, we had left this same school convinced that love alone could solve every problem waiting beyond those brick walls. We married young because waiting seemed unnecessary. We rented a small apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, furnished it with secondhand furniture, and laughed every time something broke because we believed we would eventually replace everything with something better. Monica worked as a marketing coordinator while I accepted an entry-level engineering position at a manufacturing company. Money was tight, but every Friday night we shared a large pizza, watched old movies, and planned the future as though success had already reserved a seat for us. Then the factory announced major layoffs. My department disappeared in less than a week. I remember carrying a cardboard box filled with family photographs, a coffee mug, and a framed certificate that suddenly seemed worthless. Monica hugged me when I walked through the apartment door that afternoon. She told me everything would be all right. I believed her because I needed to. The first few months passed with optimism. I submitted applications every morning, attended interviews, and promised Monica that something would work out soon. When nothing happened, I decided to build a small software consulting business with a former coworker. We invested nearly every dollar we had saved. For a while it looked promising, but clients canceled projects, bills continued arriving, and our savings disappeared faster than either of us expected. The apartment that once echoed with laughter became painfully quiet. Monica stopped asking how my meetings had gone because she already knew the answer. I stopped talking about my fears because I did not want her to carry them with me. Silence slowly replaced conversation, not because we stopped loving each other, but because disappointment became easier to hide than to explain. One evening she sat across from me at our tiny kitchen table, turning her wedding ring around her finger without looking into my eyes. Her voice remained calm when she said she could not keep living with uncertainty. She told me she needed stability, a future she could actually see instead of one I kept promising was just around the corner. I listened without arguing because part of me understood exactly what she meant. When the divorce papers arrived weeks later, I signed them with hands that barely trembled. I never begged her to stay. I simply wished her happiness and walked away carrying a single suitcase, believing that perhaps she deserved the future I had failed to give her. Standing once again inside Jefferson High School 8 years later, I realized she still believed that was where my story had ended. The memories faded as I looked away from the old photographs and returned my attention to the reunion unfolding around me. But my mind remained trapped in the years nobody in this room had witnessed. After signing the divorce papers, I rented a studio apartment barely large enough for a bed, a folding table, and a single chair. Every morning I woke before sunrise, brewed the cheapest coffee I could find, and reminded myself of one promise. I never promised that I would become rich. I never promised that one day people would admire me. I only promised that I would never again become the man who measured his worth through someone else's opinion. That quiet promise carried me through days that felt impossibly long. I accepted temporary engineering contracts wherever I could find them, drove hundreds of miles every week across Ohio, and spent evenings teaching myself software development through online courses instead of watching television. Some nights I fell asleep with my laptop still open beside me. Other mornings I questioned whether any of it mattered. The business failure had damaged more than my savings. It had damaged my confidence. Every rejection email seemed to confirm what I feared most, that perhaps Monica had simply recognized a truth I had refused to accept. Yet every time that thought appeared, I forced myself back to work. One page of code, one job application, one networking event, one more attempt. Progress became so small that it could only be measured over months instead of days. Nearly 2 years passed before an unexpected phone call changed the direction of my life. An old colleague named Victor invited me to meet him at a small technology incubator in downtown Columbus. He and 2 other engineers had been developing logistics software for regional manufacturers, but needed someone willing to solve problems nobody else wanted. The office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building above a family-owned bakery. The conference room contained mismatched chairs, outdated computers, and a whiteboard stained with months of erased ideas. Nothing about the place suggested future success, but something about the determination inside that room reminded me of the person I had almost forgotten. I accepted a salary that barely covered my rent because I believed more in the people than the paycheck. The days became longer than ever before. We worked through weekends, tested endless prototypes, lost clients, found new ones, and celebrated tiny victories with takeout sandwiches shared around folding desks. Nobody talked about becoming billionaires. We talked about surviving another month. Slowly, the software improved. Small manufacturers recommended us to larger companies. Investors began scheduling meetings instead of ignoring our emails. Every milestone arrived quietly, without headlines or applause. During those years, I never searched for Monica online. I never asked mutual friends about her life. Looking backward demanded energy that I needed for moving forward. The man who had walked away carrying one suitcase slowly disappeared, replaced by someone who understood that success was built through ordinary mornings repeated thousands of times. Standing inside the reunion years later, listening to distant laughter echo across the gymnasium, I realized none of my former classmates had seen those invisible years. They had only known the version of Caleb who failed. They had absolutely no idea who I had become while nobody was watching. The years that followed did not transform our company overnight. They transformed us one ordinary day at a time. Every Monday morning began with coffee brewed in a machine that rattled louder than it worked, followed by meetings around a scratched conference table where every dollar mattered. We celebrated when we signed a new client because it meant another month of keeping the lights on. We accepted setbacks without drama because there was no time for disappointment. There was only the next problem waiting to be solved. I became known as the person who stayed after everyone else had gone home. If a customer called at 9 o'clock at night, I answered. If software failed during a weekend installation, I drove across the state instead of making excuses. Those habits did not make headlines, but they built something far more valuable than recognition. They built trust. 3 years after I joined the company, one of the largest manufacturing groups in the Midwest agreed to test our logistics platform in several facilities. It was the opportunity we had been chasing for years. We spent months preparing every detail, checking every report, and improving every feature until we knew the system better than our own schedules. When the pilot program exceeded expectations, more contracts followed. Investors who had once ignored us suddenly wanted meetings. Banks that had politely declined our requests now offered financing. The little office above the bakery eventually became too small, and we moved into a modern building overlooking the Scioto River. We hired engineers, designers, and customer support teams. Our company continued growing until national publications began writing about our technology. Eventually, an international investment group acquired a majority stake while allowing the founding leadership to remain in place. My ownership shares, earned through years of sacrifice instead of sudden luck, quietly became worth more money than I had ever imagined possible. Friends congratulated me. Financial reporters called me successful. Yet the greatest change had nothing to do with numbers. Success gave me something that failure never could. It gave me peace. I no longer woke every morning wondering whether my value depended on another person's approval. I bought a comfortable home outside Columbus, but I never filled it with expensive displays meant to impress visitors. I drove a reliable luxury sedan because it was comfortable on long trips, not because I wanted strangers to notice it. My weekends became simple. Morning runs through the neighborhood, coffee on the back patio, books stacked beside the fireplace, and quiet dinners with a few close friends who had known me before success arrived. They reminded me that character grows long before wealth does. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my assistant placed a cream-colored envelope on my desk. The return address immediately caught my attention. Jefferson High School Alumni Association. I smiled to myself before opening it. Inside was an invitation to our 10-year class reunion. I almost laughed. 8 years had passed since my divorce from Monica, and I had not spoken to her once. For several minutes, I simply stared at the invitation while the afternoon sunlight stretched across my office floor. Part of me wanted to decline without another thought. The past had already taken enough from me. But another part quietly whispered that perhaps avoiding the reunion meant I was still allowing yesterday to control today. I folded the invitation carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and looked out. across the city skyline. I was no longer afraid of seeing the people who remembered my worst chapter. I only wondered whether they were ready to meet the man who had written every chapter since then without their applause. The invitation remained on my desk for 3 days before I finally responded. I did not hesitate because I feared seeing Monica again. That chapter had already ended. I hesitated because I wondered whether returning to Jefferson High School would tempt me to measure my present against memories that no longer deserved my attention. On the 4th morning, I signed the response card, slipped it into the envelope, and asked my assistant to mail it before I could change my mind. The decision felt surprisingly light. I was not returning to prove anything. I was returning because the past no longer controlled me. During the following weeks, life continued at its usual pace. Board meetings filled my calendar. Product launches demanded long hours. Investors scheduled conference calls from different time zones. Even after the company reached a level of success that financial magazines occasionally described with headlines I never expected to read, my routine remained remarkably ordinary. I still arrived at the office before most employees. I still preferred eating lunch in the company cafeteria instead of private dining rooms. I still walked through every department at least once a week because I believed people deserved to know the person making decisions that affected their careers. Wealth had changed my circumstances, but it had never changed the values I built during the years when every dollar mattered. As the reunion approached, several coworkers encouraged me to enjoy the evening. Victor laughed and joked that I should arrive in the most expensive sports car money could buy. I smiled and shook my head. That was never my style. The following Saturday, I chose a tailored navy suit, polished black shoes, and the same silver watch I had worn for years. It was elegant without demanding attention. I drove my dark luxury sedan because it was comfortable, not because it announced success. Before leaving home, I stood quietly in front of the hallway. Mirror for a moment. I did not see the unemployed husband who had once questioned his own worth. I saw a man who had survived disappointment without allowing bitterness to become part of his character. That difference mattered more than anything parked in my garage or displayed on my balance sheet. The drive to Jefferson High School took just under 40 minutes. Familiar roads passed beneath the tires as old neighborhoods slowly came back into view. I recognized the small diner where Monica and I had shared pancakes after church on Sunday mornings. The movie theater where we celebrated our first wedding anniversary had been replaced by a grocery store. Time had changed the town, just as it had changed all of us. When I pulled into the crowded parking lot, expensive pickup trucks stood beside compact sedans, family SUVs, and older cars that had clearly traveled many miles. Success wore many different faces, and appearances revealed very little. I stepped out, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the entrance where classmates greeted one another with loud excitement. Some recognized me immediately, while others searched my face before remembering my name. Every handshake felt warm, every conversation polite, and for a while the evening unfolded exactly as I had hoped. Then I noticed a familiar emerald green dress moving through the crowd. Monica entered the room beside a sharply dressed man with effortless confidence. She laughed as friends surrounded her, accepting compliments as though she had rehearsed the moment for years. Our eyes met from opposite sides of the gymnasium. Her smile paused for only a second before returning with quiet certainty. She began walking directly toward me, and although I remained perfectly calm, I could already sense that this reunion was about to become something none of us would ever forget. Monica stopped less than 3 feet away from me, carrying the same confident smile that had once convinced me she could brighten any room. Standing beside her was a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit whose polished appearance suggested he enjoyed introducing himself through first impressions. Monica rested one hand lightly on his arm before speaking. "Caleb, it has certainly been a long time." Her tone sounded warm enough to anyone listening, but I recognized the faint edge beneath it. I smiled politely. "It has. I hope life has treated you well." She nodded with quiet satisfaction. "It really has." She turned slightly toward the man beside her. "This is my husband, Darren." He extended his hand immediately. "Nice to meet you. Monica has told me a little about you." I shook his hand firmly. "Likewise." Before I could say anything else, another classmate wandered over holding a plate of appetizers. "Caleb, what have you been up to all these years?" It was an ordinary question, but Monica answered before I had the opportunity. "I have been wondering the same thing." she said with a light laugh that invited everyone nearby to listen. You disappeared after the divorce. I guess life took us in very different directions. A few former classmates drifted closer without pretending otherwise. Reunions had a way of turning ordinary conversations into unexpected entertainment. I kept my expression relaxed. Life has been busy. Monica tilted her head slightly. Busy doing what? Her question sounded innocent, yet something about the way she held eye contact suggested she already believed she knew the answer. I simply replied, working. She smiled again. Well, that is good. Everyone has to start somewhere. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Darren chuckled softly before adding, the important thing is staying positive. His words were polite enough, but they carried the quiet confidence of someone who assumed he understood another person's story without asking for it. Monica folded her arms comfortably. Do you remember how determined Caleb always was? He used to talk about building something incredible. She laughed gently. Sometimes life has different plans. The small circle around us responded with scattered laughter that faded almost as quickly as it appeared. No one seemed completely comfortable joining in, but nobody interrupted either. I looked around the room instead of defending myself. The banners hanging from the ceiling still displayed our graduating class colors. Old songs drifted through the speakers. Teachers who had retired years earlier stood near the stage sharing stories with former students. It struck me how strange it was that an evening meant to celebrate shared memories had quietly become another contest over whose life appeared more successful. Monica mistook my silence for defeat. You are very quiet tonight, she observed. You used to explain everything. I met her eyes and smiled. Some lessons only need to be learned once. She seemed surprised by the answer, but quickly recovered. Before she could continue, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone twice. The soft conversations throughout the gymnasium slowly faded as everyone turned toward the front of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced with an enthusiastic smile, before dinner is served, we have a very special surprise to share with all of you. This reunion would not have been possible without the generosity of one extraordinary alumnus who asked to remain anonymous until tonight. A ripple of curiosity spread through the audience. Monica glanced toward the stage with mild interest before looking back at me one final time, completely unaware that within the next few minutes, every assumption she had carried for the past 8 years was about to collide with the truth. The room became completely silent as the master of ceremonies unfolded a single card and smiled toward the audience. Before we continue with dinner, he said, our reunion committee would like to recognize the graduate whose generosity made tonight possible. In addition to sponsoring this entire event, this individual has established a permanent scholarship fund that will support Jefferson High School seniors pursuing careers in engineering, technology, and business. A wave of surprised whispers spread across the gymnasium. People began looking around the room, quietly guessing who among them had achieved that level of success. Several eyes settled on local business owners, successful attorneys, and physicians from our graduating class. Nobody looked in my direction. The master of ceremonies continued speaking. Our anonymous donor specifically requested that the scholarship focus on students whose families may not have the financial resources to pursue higher education. He told us that opportunity changed his life, and he hopes to create that same opportunity for others. My heartbeat remained steady. I had insisted on staying anonymous from the beginning, but the alumni committee convinced me that publicly announcing the scholarship might inspire future donations. They promised the recognition would remain brief. I had agreed because the students mattered more than my preference for privacy. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of ceremonies said with unmistakable enthusiasm, please join me in thanking Mr. Caleb Brooks, founder and chairman of Brooks Integrated Systems. For one long second, nothing happened. The audience simply stared, trying to connect the quiet man standing near the refreshment table with the name they had just heard. Then several members of the reunion committee began applauding. The applause spread gradually until the entire room filled with the sound of hundreds of hands coming together. Monica's smile disappeared before she even realized it. Darren blinked twice, looking first toward the stage and then directly at me, as though expecting someone else to stand. A woman beside Monica whispered, "Wait, Caleb." Another classmate pulled out a phone, searched my company, and quietly gasped before turning the screen toward the others. Within moments, expressions of confusion transformed into astonishment. The master of ceremonies invited me onto the stage. I walked forward at the same relaxed pace I had used all evening. There was no dramatic entrance, no triumphant grin, and no desire to embarrass anyone. I accepted the microphone only after shaking hands with the committee members. "Thank you," I said. "Jefferson High School gave me teachers who believed in me long before I believed in myself. This scholarship is simply my way of giving another student the chance to build a future they may not yet be able to imagine." I paused briefly, looking across the familiar faces filling the gymnasium. Success is rarely the result of one extraordinary moment. It is usually built through ordinary days that nobody else notices. The applause returned, louder than before, but I kept my remarks short. Recognition had never been the purpose. As I stepped away from the microphone, several former classmates hurried toward me with warm congratulations, eager to shake my hand and ask questions about the company they suddenly recognized from business magazines and financial news. Across the room, Monica remained perfectly still. She was no longer looking at the man she believed had failed 8 years earlier. She was looking at someone whose life had continued far beyond the ending she had imagined. And for the first time since I had walked into Jefferson High School that evening, she seemed completely unable to find the words she wanted to say. When the applause finally settled into quiet conversations again, I stepped down from the stage and returned the microphone to the master of ceremonies. Several teachers stopped me before I reached the floor, thanking me for remembering the school that had shaped so many of us. I thanked each of them sincerely because every word they spoke reminded me that none of us succeed entirely alone. Former classmates formed a loose line, introducing spouses, asking about the company, and sharing memories that had been buried for nearly a decade. The questions came naturally. They wanted to know how everything had happened, when the business began to grow, and whether success had changed my life. I answered honestly without mentioning numbers or achievements. I spoke about discipline instead of wealth, consistency instead of luck, and the value of showing up every day long after excitement disappears. Eventually, the crowd began drifting toward dinner, and the room slowly returned to the comfortable rhythm it had before the announcement. I picked up another glass of sparkling water and stepped into the quieter hallway outside the gymnasium, hoping for a few peaceful minutes away from the attention. The familiar trophy cases reflected the warm lights above, and the hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint mixed with old memories. I heard footsteps behind me before I turned around. Monica stood several feet away with her, hands gently folded in front of her. For the first time that evening, there was no confident smile waiting on her face. There was only uncertainty. She stopped beside one of the display cases and looked at the photographs without speaking. "I never knew," she finally said in a quiet voice. "There was nothing to know," I answered calmly. We had not spoken in 8 years. She nodded slowly. "I suppose that is true." A long silence settled comfortably between us. It no longer felt heavy. It simply acknowledged everything that had changed. Monica looked toward me with an expression I had not seen in years. "When I saw you walk into the reunion tonight, I thought I already knew your story. I believed I understood how your life had turned out." I smiled gently. Most people only see the chapters they happen to witness. She lowered her eyes for a moment. "I should not have spoken to you the way I did in front of everyone. That was unfair." There was no excuse in her voice, no attempt to justify her behavior, only a simple acknowledgement of it. "Thank you," I replied. "I appreciate you saying that." She took a slow breath before continuing. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Were you trying to prove something by coming tonight?" I shook my head almost immediately. "No. If I wanted to prove something, I would have announced who I was the moment I arrived. I came because I realized I was no longer afraid of my past." Monica looked away again, and I could almost see that answer settling into her thoughts. "I spent years believing you never recovered after the divorce," she admitted quietly. "I was wrong. Life surprised both of us," I said. "It usually does." She gave a small smile, softer than any expression she had shown all evening. "Congratulations, Caleb. Not because of the money. Because you seem peaceful." That word stayed with me longer than any compliment about business ever had. I realized then that the greatest difference between the man she divorced and the man standing before her had nothing to do with success. One had desperately wanted to be accepted. The other had already accepted himself, and no amount of praise or criticism could ever take that away. Monica and I walked back into the gymnasium together without saying another word. We did not need to. Some conversations are completed long before people stop speaking. The music had started again, dinner was being served, and the reunion slowly returned to the comfortable rhythm it had before the announcement. A few classmates smiled as I passed, while others waved me over to join their table. Their expressions had changed, but I had not. I accepted every handshake with the same quiet gratitude and listened far more than I talked. For years I had imagined what it might feel like to return to this place after rebuilding my life. I once believed that moment would be filled with satisfaction, perhaps even triumph. Instead, I discovered something much simpler. Peace leaves very little room for revenge. Later that evening, one of my former teachers approached me carrying an old yearbook. She asked whether I would sign it beside my senior photograph. I smiled as I wrote a single sentence beneath my name. Never allow one difficult season to become the definition of your entire life. She read it, looked up at me with kind eyes, and quietly thanked me. That meant more than any business award sitting in my office. As the evening drew to a close, people slowly gathered near the entrance, exchanging hugs, promising to stay in touch, and taking photographs to preserve another chapter of their lives. Darren walked over before leaving. He extended his hand once again, this time with genuine respect instead of casual confidence. "Congratulations on everything you have built," he said. "It is impressive." I shook his hand and smiled. "Thank you. I wish both of you nothing but the best." He nodded sincerely before walking toward the parking lot. Monica remained behind for another moment. The noise around us faded into the background as she looked at the familiar school one final time. "I spent a long time believing success always announced itself," she said softly. "Tonight, I learned that real success does not need to." I smiled. The strongest things usually speak the least. She gave a quiet laugh before reaching out for a brief handshake. It was a simple gesture, free from regret, anger, or unfinished expectations. Just two people acknowledging that life had carried them in different directions. "Take care of yourself, Caleb," she said. "You too, Monica." We walked toward separate cars without looking back. As I settled into the driver's seat, I paused before starting the engine and looked once more at the lights shining through the windows of Jefferson High School. 8 years earlier, I had left my marriage believing I had lost everything that mattered. I now understood that I had only lost a version of my life that was never meant to last. The road home stretched quietly ahead beneath the evening sky, and for the first time in many years, I felt grateful for every disappointment that had forced me to become someone stronger than the man I used to be. Wealth had given me comfort. Hard work had given me confidence. Forgiveness had given me freedom. As the school disappeared in my rearview mirror, I realized the reunion had never been about proving Monica wrong or proving myself right. It had been about discovering that my worth had never depended on another person's opinion. Some victories arrive with applause. The ones that truly change your life arrive with peace. I drove home without anger, without pride, and without the need for anyone else to understand my journey. I had not won my former wife back. I had won back the man I almost lost, and that was the only ending that had ever truly mattered.